but I want to just talk a little bit specifically around the process of permanent normalized trade relations with China. Understanding 1990s globalization is completely inseparable from the rise of the crisis we're in today, from the rise of right-wing authoritarian leaders and the damages of people like Donald Trump, to the hollowing out of the leadership of the Democratic Party, and the class dynamics in industrial countries, and also the shifting power balances to Asia, as well as the persistent brutal inequalities and underdevelopment of much of the so-called developing world. And the China one, I mean, we'll focus on all of these. We'll do one specifically on NAFTA. NAFTA really was a paradigm shift in these deals. And it's just important. And I think everybody is familiar with, as an example, go back in the archives, listen to the interview with Quinn Slobodian, where he really did an accurate history of neoliberalism as a regimented pro-government project, that it was not a question of laissez-faire. If you go back into the history of libertarian economic thinkers like von Mises, they were actually reacting to the rise of social democracy and worker movements in an attempt to maintain very rigid class hierarchies. And the through line that he connects through the foundation of things like the World Trade Organization are not that this isn't trade like, okay, this farm in Kenya has some really good organic coffee. We want to buy it. So there's relatively loose bureaucratic controls in terms of, purchasing the coffee, like, not having exorbitant border taxes or something like that. That trade deals in the modern iteration cover a huge set of regulatory frameworks across the board that basically just shape these trade deals in a way that benefits corporations. Now, permanent normalized trade relations with China is uniquely important and really emerges. I mean, this is one of the last major policy pushes that Bill Clinton did before he left office. And there was fierce resistance from labor unions, from environmentalists, and from people with a variety of human rights concerns, including around, repression and abuses in occupied Tibet, and so on. And you will hear some arguments and cliches in this clip that defined the China trade bill. And remember, this is 2 years after the uprisings in Seattle, or 1 year. So Bill Clinton had already kind of claimed that he heard the critiques of corporate globalization from unions and from activists and civil society. Well, not enough to not push for PNTR. And PNTR, basically, what it means is, instead of renewing a trade agreement, renewing with China on a yearly basis and doing things like a human rights review, which I agree has its own set of problems, but that basically you would just, every year automatically, China is a most favored trading partner of the United States. And this is a precondition for China joining the WTO, which they did in 2001. Every country that's a member of the WTO needs to have permanent normalized trade relations with other countries in the WTO structure. That's how it works, bureaucratically. This is Bill Clinton, May 18th, 2000, with Alan Greenspan making the case for PNTR with China. And I'll wrap it up and explain where we are today after we get a dose of this vintage push here.
All the former presidents support it, along with former secretaries of state, defense, trade, transportation, national security advisors, chairs of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, religious leaders, many of the courageous people in China fighting for human rights and the rule of law. Momentum is building, but we've still got a challenging fight. I thank Chairman Greenspan for coming here today, and I'd like for him to say whatever is on his mind about this issue. Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. The outcome of the debate on permanent normal trade relations with China will have profound implications for the free world's trading system and the long-term growth potential of the American economy. Jim Leach, the chairman of the House Banking Committee, a couple of weeks ago, requested that I share with his committee my perspective on PNTR for China. Let me read you my response. The addition of the Chinese economy to the global marketplace will result in a more efficient worldwide allocation of resources and will raise standards of living in China and its trading partners. Should China accept the challenge of international competition embodied in World Trade Organization membership, it will doubtless promote internal economic development, encourage the adoption of modern technologies, and contribute to lifting its citizens out of poverty. History has demonstrated that implicit in any removal of power from central planners and broadening of market mechanisms, as would occur under WTO, is a more general spread of rights to individuals. Such a development will be a far stronger vehicle to foster other individual rights than any other alternative of which I'm aware.
Okay, so a lot to unpack there. First of all, that's exactly the Slobodian point, which is that these trade agreements and mechanisms like the WTO are not exactly a easing of repression on personal liberties. They're roadmaps for highly regimented trade regimens that support and favor incumbent interests, whether it be in the food industry, finance, pharma, or manufacturing. That those two things actually have very little to do with each other. And of course, we can look at examples like the libertarian role in Pinochet's Chile after the coup, and any number of areas in the world where marketization runs counter to democratization. But this was the universally accepted story back at that time, almost universally. There were progressives who were concerned about labor and other areas. There was some isolationist tendencies as well, but the mainstream conversation, this was completely common wisdom, even though it was already, at the very least, deeply historically disputed or if not entirely discredited by both examples like Chile and even places like Singapore, which a lot of leaders fetishize in the Western world. Now, what's happened since then, first of all, on the American jobs level, which we need to be able to talk about and be really clear about from the perspective of left-wing politics in America and taking on the corporate leadership of the Democratic Party and having reviving, frankly, the spirit of the WTO protests, so that critiquing these horrible trade regimes is not just the sort of province of a reactionary nativist presidency. This is from Economic Policy Institute. China trade deficit has cost 3.7 American jobs between 2001 and 2018. Jobs lost in every state and congressional district. The growth of the trade and the U.S. jobs lost are spread throughout the country, but are concentrated in manufacturing, including industries in which the United States has traditionally held competitive advantage. I'm continuing to quote. The growth of the U.S. trade deficit with China between 2001 and 2018 was responsible for the loss of 3.7 U.S. jobs, including 1.7 million jobs lost since 2008, the first full year of the Great Recession, which technically began at the end of 2007. And I'm thinking of the great late journalist William Greider, who wrote this brilliant book in the late 90s called One World, Ready or Not, where he critiqued corporate globalization. And he has a quote that he was talking to a manager who was involved in outsourcing. And basically, this guy was saying, like, it's too late. We're going to send the high-paying jobs to low-wage countries. And he had some line, which is pretty prophetic, where he said, yeah, the future in the United States will be in the service economy, whatever that means, which I'm paraphrasing, but I mean, exactly. Low wage, precarious jobs. And these things have run in concert. Now, the counterexample is there's a lot of cheap goods, right? You can go and you can slap your credit card down and get low price consumer electronics. And I don't have much time to go into all of it, but I think most people would prefer higher paid and empowered jobs versus the ability to go into debt for cheap electronics, right? So I think that that's the argument there is pretty clear. Then with regards to what happened in China, yes, took advantage of a lot of cheap labor in China. And there still to this day is obviously a need for more independent trade union activity everywhere in the world, including in China, obviously. But this calculation completely missed the fact that China was learning from both Singapore and Malaysia how they were fusing different forms of government with marketization, as well as their own terror at the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that they would cultivate their own model. They would cultivate their own model, both in terms of the human rights issues that they alluded to, and they would also not follow, and this is to China's credit, just as we would strongly criticize the human rights issues and should, they didn't follow a traditional market model at all, which is why in addition to general industrialization, which has relieved some poverty, they've actually been much more strategic about developing industries and coordinated growth than in places in developing world that are just have the Washington consensus inflicted on them. So we're in 2020. In 2016, the hollowed out base of America, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump talked to it. Donald Trump connected it with xenophobia and racism and conspiracy theories. But there is this tradition that includes the great work of someone like Sherrod Brown. And also going back to the late 90s globalization protests, where there was a synchronized understanding that the abuse and exploitation overseas was absolutely, not only were workers in the United States and Mexico not at odds, they were victims of similar forces. And that the process was to lift the ground floor up on everybody and have global regimens that were built on foundations of labor standards and not just what corporations wanted. So a lot more to get into. We'll talk a lot more about it, but I think that's an important kind of primer, specifically the way it revolves around some of the dynamics with China.
For sure. I have to say, for anyone who's interested in this conversation and also sort of like where we're at today, Aaron Brenoff has a really interesting piece in the New Left Review. I think the December issue, and I believe they've made that public as well. Sort of pushing back against the automation discourse in the US, right? That automation is like the dominant mode of production. That's why people have lost jobs. But he does it. He actually really proves something else that is quite frightening, which is that there's such global overproduction of goods that basically is becoming so cheap to produce that, like, even in China, there's mass deindustrialization ongoing as well. So it's like, while this like globalization story of the past 2 decades had like massive effects around the world, we're actually almost are moving into a new era as well when it comes to just massive global deindustrialization and the fundamental crisis of the capitalist production model. So, there's a lot that we have to be diving into, and we have to be very responsive to a changing world, which I think is the real lesson, honestly, when you look back at the left in the United States, for example, over the past 2 decades, was a sort of refusal to see what was going on around them.
Absolutely. 100%.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.